He changed his clothes to check on his store, but he didn't expect to find the cashier in tears. What she said changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The Atlanta sun pressed down heavy that day, weighing on the city like a memory no one could forget. The streets shimmered in the late spring heat, and downtown buzzed with the usual rhythm of honking cars, fluttering paper cups, and exhausted pedestrians moving with silent purpose. Inside the air-conditioned cool of the Intercontinental, Blake Hunter adjusted the cuffs of his linen shirt and nodded absently at the young executive seated across from him. The man was speaking, something about market expansion, quarterly returns, overseas procurement. But Blake's thoughts were elsewhere. He stared past the man's shoulder through the clean pane of glass that framed the skyline. Somewhere beyond that horizon was a store. Not a flagship or model branch, not a polished pilot location filled with staged optimism and curated customers. No, Blake was thinking of one of the old stores, one that had stood for years in a part of Atlanta people rarely included in postcards. Store Hash 17. A place where he hadn't stepped foot in more than a decade. Blake Hunter was 60 years old that month. Still lean, still broad-shouldered beneath his tailored shirts, his silvering hair gave him the distinguished appearance expected of someone whose net worth sat in the billions. He was, by every account that mattered in his world, a success. The founder and CEO of Quick Choice, one of the fastest-growing discount retail chains in the southeastern United States. A man with 2 honorary doctorates, 3 beachfront properties, and his name etched into granite outside the business school of a private university. And yet, as he listened to the junior VP across the table drone about efficiency metrics, Blake felt only a strange hollowness forming behind his ribs. Something had shifted. Maybe it was the way the young man had used the phrase human capital 3 times in 5 minutes. Or maybe it was just the way the numbers sounded so clean, so bloodless. There was no mention of the people behind them, no stories, no faces. After dinner, after the wine and handshakes and laughter that rang a bit too loud, Blake rode the elevator up to his suite alone. The city glittered below like 1,000 promises he no longer believed. He stood by the window, loosening his tie, and wondered what it would feel like to walk unannounced into one of his own stores. No press release, no advance team, no security detail. Just him. He made the call himself, an old contact in regional logistics, asked if they had any auditors or seasonal floaters scheduled for Store Hash 17. They didn't. That was good. An hour later, dressed in khaki pants, a navy hoodie, and a faded Quick Choice ball cap pulled low over his face, Blake stood outside the fluorescent-lit entrance of the store. He had borrowed an old ID badge that read Operations Support Greg and clipped it to his shirt. No one questioned him as he walked in. It was a Friday night. The store buzzed with end-of-week shoppers, tired mothers with half-asleep toddlers, elderly men shuffling along the detergent aisle, teenagers loitering near the snack shelves. Blake moved slowly, absorbing the atmosphere. The lights flickered slightly in the back half of the store. The floor tiles were scuffed, the signage outdated. Music played faintly through the ceiling speakers, something upbeat and synthetic that clashed with the fatigue in the air. A group of employees gathered near the checkout lanes, joking quietly but without ease. Their laughter sounded practiced, like something they were required to perform. He made his way past the refrigerated section, where condensation clouded the glass doors, and into the narrow back aisle where cleaning supplies and off-brand pet food sat ignored. It was there, in the sliver of shadow between an old display rack and a dented stack of mop buckets, that he heard it. At first, it was just a sound, a breath caught too sharply, a soft stutter in the air. Then it came again, a quiet sob, not loud, not uncontrolled, the kind of cry someone tries to bury deep in their throat and almost succeeds. Almost. He paused. Slowly, carefully, he edged closer. There, hunched low behind a broken end cap shelf, was a young woman. She wore the standard quick choice uniform, dark slacks and a red polo shirt with a frayed collar. Her headset hung limp around her neck. A name tag read Jada. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her shoulders trembled as she clutched her phone to her ear with one hand, her other hand covering her face. "I'm trying," she whispered. "Okay? I swear I'm trying." Blake froze. Her voice was low, roughened by emotion. "I can't miss another shift. If I do, they'll cut my hours again. I haven't paid the electric bill. I'm getting eviction warnings. I'm doing everything I can." There was a pause. Then her voice cracked again, sharp and quiet. "No, I didn't tell them. What's the point? HR doesn't listen. They say flexibility is key. But if you're not available 24/7, you're out. That's the system now. You either disappear or get replaced." Another pause. Blake barely breathed. "I lost Mom. I lost the house. I'm losing me. I don't even know why I keep coming in anymore." She let out a laugh, dry, hollow. "I just want one person to see me. Once, even if it's the guy who wrote these stupid rules. But people like him, they don't come to places like this, not really." Blake's grip tightened on the clipboard he carried. Her words pierced deeper than he was ready for. She was talking about him. Not knowing, not guessing, but naming the truth all the same. He backed away slowly, heart pounding, and returned to the front of the store. He waited for her to reappear behind Register 3. Her eyes were red, but her face wore the expression of someone who had mastered the art of pretending. She smiled at the next customer and scanned items with practiced speed. Blake left the store in silence. He climbed into the back of the car alone, told the driver to return to the hotel, and sat with his hands clasped, staring at nothing in particular. He didn't sleep that night. Not because of guilt, though it gnawed at him, but because of what he had seen. Not just a struggling worker, but a reflection of the very culture he had helped to design. Back in his suite, he sat at the desk and powered on his laptop. The company portal glowed against the darkness. His fingers hovered over the keys. He began to search. Jada Wallace. Age, 28. Role, frontline associate. Store hash, 17, Atlanta, Georgia. Hired August 2019. Performance rating, excellent. Customer satisfaction, above average. Attendance, good, with 2 recent unexcused absences pending documentation. Then he saw it. Weekly hours, 32, 28, 24, 16, 8. The decline had begun 6 weeks ago. Her record was nearly spotless until then. The system had flagged her after 2 days marked low availability, personal emergency. No one had followed up. No one had checked why. The algorithm had acted. The hours had vanished. Blake stared at the screen. He remembered approving that system. Remembered the presentation from the consultants. Bright-eyed men in well-fitted suits talking about optimization, scheduling efficiency, reducing overhead. It rewards availability, they had said. It builds loyalty by rewarding the most committed. They hadn't said what it did to single mothers, or to people who buried their mothers. He sat back in the chair. The hum of the city outside continued, indifferent and distant. He had built a machine, and that machine was quietly, cleanly, professionally breaking people. The young woman with the trembling voice had said something else, something that haunted him more than he expected. "I just want one person to see me." He closed the laptop and whispered, "I saw you." And for the first time in years, Blake Hunter didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man who'd been called out by a stranger in the shadows of his own empire. Tomorrow he would go back, and this time he would stay long enough to really understand what he'd built and what it was costing. Morning crept into the city with the lazy determination of spring in the south. Light filtered through the sheer curtains of the suite, casting pale rectangles on the carpet. Blake Hunter had not moved from his chair. His laptop was still open, glowing faintly, the company's internal system idle on the screen. His blazer had slipped off sometime during the night and now hung loosely on the back of the chair, one sleeve grazing the floor. The night had not brought rest, only thought. Thoughts that turned over and over in his mind like river stones smoothed by years of avoidance. Jada Wallace. He hadn't known her name until 2 hours ago. Now it was burned into his mind with an urgency he couldn't shake. Not because she had said something revolutionary, but because she had said something honest. Something he had not heard in years within the marble-walled conference rooms of Quick Choice headquarters. He pulled the laptop closer and clicked through her employee profile again, scrutinizing the timeline. August 2019. Hired as a part-time associate, promoted to full hours in under 5 months. Multiple commendations from customers listed in the system. Always kind. Helpful during a long line. Genuine smile even late at night. No complaints. No write-ups. A perfect worker by any reasonable standard. Then came the shift. The graph on her availability began a slow but unmistakable decline. 6 weeks ago, she had been listed at 32 hours per week. Then, following 2 flagged absences, she dropped to 24, then to 16, and finally to a meager 8 hours. A single shift per week. The digital summary next to the decline read, "Low Reliability Index System Adjustment Recommended." There was no note about why she missed those days, just 2 cold entries, unexcused, personal, and grace used. No follow-up, no manual review, just the algorithm doing what it was built to do, optimize. Blake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He remembered the meeting now. It had been over a year ago, a boardroom in Charlotte. The consultants from Stratcor had made a strong case. Flex Shed is an adaptive algorithm, one of them had said, pointing to a slide titled Optimizing Labor Allocation in Real Time. It prioritizes high-availability staff while naturally reducing scheduling opportunities for inconsistent performers. Objective, streamlined, scalable. He remembered nodding, signing off without hesitation. It sounded efficient, fair even. Let the system reward commitment. But no one had mentioned nuance. No one had talked about mothers, or caretakers, or grief. He dug deeper. Pulled up the Flex Shed documentation. Page after page of metrics, benchmarks, tiered behavior scores, and dynamic availability charts. It was mathematically elegant, coldly perfect. Nowhere in the documentation did the word context appear. His chest tightened. He closed the file. Outside the window, the city had come to life. Delivery trucks rumbled down side streets, car horns barked distantly, and pedestrians began their daily shuffle across hot concrete. The hotel suite, soundproofed and serene, felt like a different world, a safe world, one that buffered people like Blake from the reality they created. He stood, stretched, and moved toward the bathroom. Splashing cold water on his face, He studied himself in the mirror. The man who looked back was still impressive, still fit for his age, still commanding, but his eyes looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the sudden weight of seeing, truly seeing something he had ignored for far too long. He dressed quickly, a different disguise this time. Loose khakis, a zip-up gray hoodie, and the same worn cap. He clipped the old operations support badge back onto his chest. Greg, the invisible auditor, was going back into the field. By 10 o'clock, he stood once again in the familiar fluorescent glow of Store Hash 17. It felt less foreign now, more real. A place not of numbers, but of lives. He moved with purpose, offering to help with stock rotation in aisle 7, then checking the restroom paper inventory. He took his time, watched, listened. The manager, a wiry man named Royce, barely gave him a second glance. Floaters were common during audit season, and Blake's unassuming manner didn't invite conversation. Jada was on register again, just like the day before. She looked rested, or at least practiced in the art of appearing that way. Her movements were precise, her interactions with customers brief but courteous. She smiled when spoken to, thanked each patron with the same even tone. It was a kind of professionalism that often went unnoticed because it never faltered. Blake noticed everything. Her uniform was freshly laundered but faded. The collar showed signs of hand-washing, frayed threads, slight discoloration at the edges. Her shoes were clean but worn thin at the soles. At one point, she stepped back to let a child run past her in the checkout lane. Her expression softened for a moment, then snapped back to neutral. During her 15-minute break, she sat alone in the break room, a cramped, fluorescent-lit space with one flickering bulb and an ancient vending machine that made more noise than function. She pulled a cup of instant noodles from her bag and added hot water from the machine. Her phone buzzed once. She read the message silently, then set it face down on the table, her expression unreadable. After she left, Blake made a quiet excuse to check the trash bin. The phone was still lit. He caught a glimpse of the screen before it dimmed. Rent overdue, final notice, eviction proceedings begin Monday. He exhaled slowly. The edges of the room blurred just slightly. The rest of the day passed in a haze of quiet observation. He learned that Marcia, the older woman in aisle 4, was working a second job cleaning offices at night. He overheard a teenage stalker whisper that he used to work full-time but was now down to weekends only after taking a week off to care for his little sister. And everywhere he listened, he heard the same undertone. Don't complain, or you'll disappear. In the afternoon, Blake stepped outside to breathe. The sun struck his face with sharp warmth, but it didn't ground him. He stood in the loading bay, hands braced on his knees, trying to process the contradictions of his empire. He had once dreamed of building something fair, something better than the greedy chains he'd competed with in his youth. Back then, he'd worked register shifts himself on weekends, brought donuts for the crew, knew every employee's name. The Quick Choice mission statement still included the phrase, "People first." When had it changed? He knew when, of course. The moment the company grew too fast for him to know more than a dozen store managers by name. The moment private equity joined the board. The moment algorithms replaced conversations. Back in the store, he finished the shift quietly. He restocked paper goods. He checked cooler temperatures. He smiled at customers who paid him no mind. That night, back in his suite, he sat again in front of the same screen, the same glowing system, but he no longer saw clean data. He saw Jada's face, heard her voice. He began typing notes into a new folder titled Redesign. The first entry, Systems cannot replace compassion. Math can't read grief. The second, if our model punishes people for being human, the model is broken. By midnight, he had mapped out a dozen questions for the next executive meeting. He marked them urgent. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man running a business. He felt like a man beginning to remember why he had started one. Blake Hunter arrived at store hash 17 just after 9 a.m. The morning light filtered through the smudged glass doors like a weak apology. The sky was overcast, low clouds pressing gently against the skyline, casting the streets in muted gray. He wore the same clothes he'd chosen the day before: khakis, hoodie, faded cap, his borrowed identity unassuming, his posture practiced. No one paid him much attention as he walked through the automatic doors and gave a perfunctory nod to the manager who barely looked up from his clipboard. The store was alive in that dull, functional way that only early retail mornings could be, half empty, humming faintly, and brimming with unspoken weariness. He walked slowly, not out of caution this time, but intent. Intent to notice the things he'd missed for years: the slight flicker in the overhead lights above the frozen section, the faded training poster peeling away from the break room door, the weight in the shoulders of the employees who moved like wind-up toys nearing the end of their tension. He spotted Jada before she noticed him. She had arrived 10 minutes early, her steps brisk but silent. She carried a plain canvas tote, probably with her lunch inside, and paused briefly by the time clock before scanning in. Her uniform, though washed and pressed with evident care, hung a little looser than it should have. Her face was composed, smooth in that practiced way of people who've been forced to endure too much while pretending nothing is wrong. She greeted Royce, the store manager, with a nod, then made her way to Register 3. She moved like someone who knew exactly where to be, how to avoid unnecessary attention, and how to keep her head down, just enough to stay off the radar without seeming disengaged. Blake recognized it instantly. It was the posture of survival. As customers began to trickle in, Jada adjusted her headset, turned on her register, and began scanning items with an efficiency that looked effortless. Her rhythm was steady, not robotic, but precise. A woman with a baby on her hip smiled at her, and Jada smiled back, genuinely but briefly. There was no time for indulgence. Blake pretended to restock a nearby shelf of canned soups, watching from the corner of his eye. He noticed how she handled each transaction. No wasted movements, no clipped words, always thank you, always next in line, always calm. She offered small kindnesses, handing receipts instead of letting them dangle, helping a man with arthritis place a gallon of milk into his cart, but never lingered, never crossed into familiarity, not out of coldness, but caution. There was a moment, around 10:20, when the store briefly emptied. For perhaps 90 seconds, her register was idle. Blake saw her glance toward the exit doors, not long, not obviously, but enough, like someone waiting for something, or someone. Her fingers hovered near the counter, flexing subtly. Then the chime of a new customer snapped her back to motion. He followed her into the break room during her scheduled 15-minute pause. She didn't notice him. He kept to the side, pretending to check the janitorial supply list posted on the corkboard. She moved quietly, efficiently, opened her tote, removed a paper-wrapped bundle and a small cup of instant noodles. She filled it from the hot water dispenser, sat at the edge of the folding table, and unwrapped a plastic fork. Her phone buzzed once. She read the message and stared at the screen longer than necessary. Then, without a word, she placed it face down. She didn't eat right away, just sat there, watching the steam rise, her hands wrapped tightly around the cup. Blake glanced again at her phone when she left. He didn't intend to invade her privacy, but the screen was still faintly lit, and the message notification was visible. Final warning, rent 3 days overdue. Eviction process begins Monday. He felt it again, that pinch of shame behind his sternum, a pressure he hadn't known in years, not since his early days, when payroll delays meant explaining face-to-face to people who needed gas money, when every dollar mattered because it came with a name. He stayed close to the front of the store the rest of the morning, sweeping aisles, fixing labels, restocking restrooms. All mundane tasks, all excuses. In truth, he was listening, watching, learning. Later that day, a teenage stalker, DeAndre, according to his badge, offered Blake a cigarette in the back alley, mistaking him for a fellow hourly employee. Blake declined, but asked about the schedule. Casually, DeAndre scoffed. "Used to get full weekends," he said. "Then I took a week off for my sister's surgery. Now they say I'm unreliable. Got cut to Saturdays only." Blake asked if anyone explained why. DeAndre laughed without humor. "Ain't nobody explains nothing, just the system, you know." Blake knew too well. He returned inside and found Marcia, an older employee in housewares, restocking shower curtains. She moved slowly, with the care of someone who understood what a fall would cost her. He offered to help, and she accepted gratefully. They made small talk, and soon she was speaking freely, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Girl at Register 3, she said, nodding toward the front, "used to pull full time, one of the best. Then her shifts started shrinking. They never tell you to quit. Just bleed you till you got no choice." That phrase stuck with him, bleed you till you got no choice. He thanked her and continued working. He could have left early, no one would have noticed. But he stayed through the close of her shift, which ended quietly just after 3 p.m. She clocked out without a word, pulling her tote onto one shoulder and walking straight past the window displays and the weekly deal signs. Blake followed her with his eyes until she disappeared beyond the parking lot. He returned to his hotel room that night, but he didn't open his laptop right away. He sat in silence for a long time. The image of Jada sitting alone in that break room, her hands wrapped around a cup of dollar noodles, wouldn't leave him. He imagined her going home, if she even had one. Imagined her counting bills, skipping meals, holding her breath every time the mailbox clicked shut. Eventually, he stood and turned on the desk lamp. The light flickered briefly before warming to full brightness. He opened the employee system again and reread her record. Everything was still there. Clean, excellent, unwavering, until the algorithm decided she no longer fit. Then he opened another file. And another. And another. Different names, different faces, same pattern. The Flex Shed system did exactly what it was designed to do. It rewarded those who were always available, always ready to fill in, to say yes, to bend their lives around the needs of the store. But it punished those who were human, who had families, responsibilities, emergencies, grief. No manager had reviewed Jada's situation. No one had intervened. The system had labeled her low reliability, and so she was quietly squeezed until her employment teetered on the edge of erasure. Just like DeAndre. Just like dozens of others Blake reviewed that night. At some point after midnight, Blake opened a blank document and began to type. He didn't have a plan yet, but he had clarity. That was new. He wrote, "Efficiency is not justice. Fairness without compassion is still cruelty. A machine can't be kind. It can only be cold." And beneath it, he added, I made the machine. The next morning, he would return, not just to watch this time, but to prepare. Something had broken open in him, not with noise, not with violence, but with quiet clarity. Jada Wallace was not just an employee. She was the mirror. And for the first time in years, Blake Hunter was looking. The sun rose behind a thin veil of cloud the next morning, spreading a pale gold across the horizon that failed to warm the glass towers of downtown Atlanta. In the corner suite of the Intercontinental, Blake Hunter stood before the full-length mirror, buttoning a charcoal gray dress shirt. The hoodie and khakis from the past 2 days lay folded on the edge of the bed, his borrowed badge now resting on the nightstand beside them. He didn't need a disguise anymore. Not today. The reflection looking back at him was clean, composed, but not shielded. His eyes, usually sharp with executive detachment, held something different now, something quieter, steadier. Not shame, not regret exactly, but the clarity that follows when someone finally stops turning away from what they've built. He adjusted his collar, chose to leave off the tie, and slipped into a tailored blazer. As he left the room, his phone vibrated. A message from his assistant. Do you want to move the 11:30 call with the board? Media wants comment on warehouse pilot delay. He typed a single response. Cancel everything. The ride to store hash 17 was silent. He didn't take the company car. He took a local rideshare dressed in a way that wouldn't draw attention but would be unmistakable once he entered. He didn't want flash. He wanted presence. The store was already in full rhythm when he arrived just after 9:15. The parking lot was half filled with aging sedans and minivans, a few customers already filtering in through the automatic doors. Inside, the usual morning routines were unfolding. A man in dairy checked expiration dates. The assistant manager argued quietly with a delivery driver over the size of a shipment. Registers beeped and measured time. Blake walked in without ceremony. There was a ripple, but not immediately. At first, only one cashier noticed. Then the floor supervisor. Then the store manager, Royce, who nearly dropped his tablet when his eyes confirmed what his brain refused to accept. Blake nodded politely to a few stunned employees as he walked toward the center aisle, just before the seasonal goods section. He stopped near a display of Easter candy and waited. Royce approached, his voice pinched with panic. Mr. Hunter, sir, I wasn't aware. Blake raised a hand, gentle but firm. No announcements, no special treatment. Just gather your team. Please. Royce hesitated, then moved quickly, radioing staff and whispering instructions. A slow current moved through the store as cashiers, stockers, and floor workers emerged from their routines, forming a hesitant semicircle near aisle 3. There were perhaps 15 of them now, young, old, uniformed in faded reds and blacks, eyes wide and uncertain. Jada was among them. She stood near the back, her register still open behind her, her tote bag tucked under the counter where she'd placed it earlier. Her arms were folded across her chest. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But she didn't leave either. Blake stood before them and looked at each face. My name, he said slowly, is Blake Hunter. I founded Quick Choice 21 years ago in a converted warehouse outside of Birmingham. I started with 12 carts, 1 register, and borrowed money. No one spoke. The only sound was the hum of overhead lights. I used to mop the floors myself. I unpacked deliveries before dawn. I stocked shelves with my own hands. And I knew then that every single person mattered. Every shift, every life. I built this company because I believed we could do it differently. Better. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. And I thought, wrongly, that as we grew, our systems, our policies, our efficiency would carry that spirit forward. That data could protect fairness. That structure could protect people. He reached into the folder he carried and held it up. "This is the employment file of one of your co-workers," he said. "Her name is Jada Wallace." A visible flinch passed through the small crowd. Jada's arms lowered slightly, her hands tense. "I reviewed this file last night," Blake continued, voice even. "Here's what I found. 3 years of reliable service, above-average customer reviews, no write-ups, no complaints. One of the most consistent performance records in this store." He opened the folder. 6 weeks ago, she used her remaining grace days to care for a family emergency. The system, Flex Shed, automatically flagged her. No human reviewed it. No one asked why. After that, her hours dropped. Not because she was late, not because she failed, but because she wasn't available on a few critical days. That's it. No conversation, no chance, just silence. Jada didn't look away. Her chin lifted ever so slightly, but her lips parted. She hadn't expected this. No one had. Blake turned toward her now, not accusing, not apologizing yet, just present. "And then," he said softly, "I overheard you. 2 nights ago, I was here in disguise, watching, listening." A breath caught somewhere in the crowd. "You didn't know I was there, but I heard what you said. I heard your fear, your exhaustion, your honesty. You said you were losing yourself, that you just wanted one person, just one, to see you." Jada blinked rapidly, a shine rising in her eyes. "I saw you," Blake said. No one moved. "I didn't come here today to pretend this was an isolated mistake. I came here to tell you this is a symptom of a system I helped build. I signed the policies. I greenlit the automation. I accepted the reports without asking the stories behind them." He turned back to the group, raising the folder slightly before dropping it, with quiet finality, onto the floor. "It ends today." Gasps fluttered through the employees like wind through dry leaves. Effective immediately, Flex Shed is suspended across the company. No more automatic cuts. No more faceless decisions. From this moment on, every change to your schedule will be reviewed by a human being. A real manager. A person who will listen. Royce shifted uneasily. The district manager, who had arrived moments earlier and now stood stiffly beside the stockroom door, opened his mouth to speak. "With all due respect," he began. Blake didn't let him finish. "No," he said simply. "You had your chance. You ran the numbers. I'll run the store." He looked again at the employees, seeing their expressions slowly shift, from disbelief to cautious hope. "There will be no retaliation," he said. "No buried warnings, no polite punishments in the form of lost hours. If you speak up, you will not disappear. You will be heard." Then he turned back to Jada. "I'm sorry," he said. She blinked, but the tears she'd once hidden now slipped freely down her cheeks. She made no move to wipe them away. There was no shame left to disguise them. "I never wanted to be the kind of leader who had to apologize in the middle of a fluorescent-lit store," he said, quieter now. "But I am, because I didn't come down here until someone broke in the dark." He reached into his briefcase once more and pulled out a small, laminated sign. It was plain, no logo, just bold, clear text. He handed it to her. "This is a human workplace," she read aloud. "If you're tired, you can sit. If you're struggling, you can speak. You will not be punished for being human." Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. "I want that placed where everyone can see it," Blake said. "Every store, every break room." She nodded. The crowd didn't clap. There was no dramatic music, no cheering, just a stillness, a shared silence. But in that quiet, something shifted. A line was crossed. A truth, long buried, was finally spoken aloud. And in the eyes of the workers who had grown used to being overlooked, something began to return. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the first shape of it: dignity. Blake remained a few minutes longer, answering questions gently, addressing staff by name where he could. He promised nothing grand, no slogans, no campaigns. Only this: that he would stay until the job was done. And for once, they believed him. Or wanted to. He watched as Jada walked back to her register. She placed the sign beside her terminal in clear view. Customers were already lining up again, unaware of what had just happened, but the air had changed. Even the silence sounded different. Blake took a step back, his eyes lingering on the sign one last time. Then, without another word, he moved toward the back of the store. Not to leave, but to begin cleaning the very mess he had helped to make. For the first time in the store's recent memory, the day did not begin with that familiar fog of resignation that lingered over fluorescent aisles. Instead, there was a tension, alive and unfamiliar. Word of the CEO's surprise visit had spread like static through the employee grapevine. They spoke of it in hushed voices, unsure if they were allowed to be excited, unsure what would follow. Some feared it was a stunt. Others dared to hope that what they had seen was real. But none of them forgot the moment when Blake Hunter, the man whose name appeared on their training manuals and quarterly newsletters, had stood before them and said, "I saw you." Jada arrived early again, earlier than usual, though she wouldn't admit why. She didn't want to say it aloud, but she felt something flutter in her chest when she walked in that morning. She found her register already spotless. A cup of tea, still steaming, sat beside the monitor. No note. Just the quiet offering of someone who understood how much words could weigh. She looked around. No one claimed it, but she caught the nod from Marcia near housewares, and it was enough. She placed her bag under the counter and glanced toward the laminated sign now propped beside the receipt printer. It was still there, still clear, still solid. Customers had noticed it too. A few had paused to read. One older gentleman nodded at her afterward, eyes kind and brief. Another woman smiled softly and said, "About time." The store had not transformed overnight, but something in its air had changed, like the shift before a coming storm, or perhaps the silence after one has passed. The usual complaints felt softer, the bickering less sharp. There was a strange politeness among the staff, as though they were walking over new ground and weren't sure how firmly they could step. Blake had stayed. That fact alone seemed to matter more than anything he had said. He hadn't returned to his suite downtown. He hadn't called for a company car or vanished behind a schedule of press calls and stakeholder meetings. Instead, he showed up just past 8 that morning, in a buttoned-up shirt without a jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbow, carrying a clipboard in one hand and a mop handle in the other. He didn't ask where he was needed. He just got to work. In aisle 5, a bottle of detergent had slipped from a careless customer's hand, leaving a thick smear across the tile. Blake didn't call for cleanup. He cleaned it himself, on his knees, scrubbing with slow, steady strokes, ignoring the curious glances from shoppers and the outright stares from passing employees. The mop bucket squeaked as he wheeled it back to the janitor's closet, leaving a trail of lemon-scented water in his wake. Later, he joined the night crew restocking shelves. He lifted boxes, opened pallets, arranged cans on metal racks, careful to keep labels forward. He asked questions, not the kind designed to test, but the kind meant to understand. Where do you come in from? How long's your commute? Who watches your kids at night? He sat with the part-timers during their breaks, splitting a vending machine sandwich with a teenage cashier who'd just started last month. The kid confessed he thought Blake was someone's retired uncle, maybe helping out. Blake didn't correct him. He just laughed and took another bite. Marcia found him later that day in the break room, pouring himself a cup of the awful store-brand coffee. "You know," she said, folding her arms with a skeptical look, "I've worked here 17 years and never seen a suit clean a toilet." Blake didn't flinch. "I've been out of practice." She gave him a long look, then sat down across from him and sighed. "My son," she said after a pause, "moved back in with me last month. Worked at the packaging plant across town until the layoffs. He's 34, never asked me for help before. Now he sleeps on my couch and pretends he's got interviews just so I won't worry." Blake listened, really listened. "He said to me last week," Marcia continued, her voice catching, "Mama, I thought if I worked hard I'd be safe." Can you believe that? Still thinking there's safety anywhere in working hard? Blake said nothing at first, then, "I used to believe that, too." They sat in silence. Just two people in a break room too small for what the world had become. That afternoon, he met again with Royce and the assistant managers. Not in an office, not at a conference table, but standing around an empty cash register near the front entrance. No preamble, no slides, just conversation. He told them the truth. The automated system was gone, and it wasn't coming back. He wanted managers to meet weekly with their staff, face to face, and approve all changes personally. He wanted one-on-one check-ins, open comment boxes, and mandatory follow-ups on every scheduled drop. "I want us to build a path back to trust," he said. "We start here." Royce looked uncomfortable. "But we don't have the time." Blake cut him off with a raised brow. "Then make the time." By evening, the story had spread through the rest of the district. Corporate hadn't issued a press release. There were no talking points, but in every employee group chat whispers circulated. The CEO was on the floor, cleaning up spills, sitting in the break room, listening. Jada watched it all quietly. She hadn't spoken much to Blake since that morning, not directly, but she watched him from afar, uncertain what she felt. Gratitude, yes, but also caution. She'd seen initiatives come and go, promises made under pressure, only to dissolve under the weight of profit margins and quarterly goals. But she couldn't deny what she saw. He stayed through closing. He counted drawers with the night manager. He helped a pregnant employee bring her bags to her car in the parking lot. He never looked at his watch. At 10:12 p.m., long after the last customer had gone, Blake sat alone in the break room again, jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. Jada passed by the open doorway. She hesitated, then stepped inside. He looked up. "You still here?" she asked, voice even. "I think that's the idea," he replied. She sat across from him, the overhead light buzzed faintly. "I keep waiting for the camera crew," she said, "for the apology video, the announcement, the statement." Blake shook his head. "This isn't for the cameras." She studied him. "Then what's it for?" He folded the legal pad shut and set his pen down. "For the people I stopped seeing." They sat there for a moment, time stretching soft between them. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A schedule. This week's shifts, 8 hours. "Still low," she said. "I know," he replied, "but next week you decide." She didn't smile, But she didn't look away either. Later, when he finally left, he walked through the darkened store alone. No cameras, no applause, only the faint sound of a floor buffer in the distance and the echo of fluorescent lights humming above. As he passed Register 3, he glanced at the laminated sign still standing there like a quiet promise. He touched it once, briefly, then walked into the night. He didn't sleep when he got back to the hotel. He wrote a letter, a memo, not to investors or partners, to everyone else. Subject line, I was wrong. And in it, he wrote not of plans or strategies or systems, but of people. Real people. Of voices that had gone unheard. Of stories that mattered. And of a promise not to fix everything overnight, but to never again ignore suffering just because it didn't appear in a report. At the end of it, he wrote, We build stores, but people live lives, and from now on, we see both. He hit send. Then, finally, he slept. 3 months had passed since that quiet moment in the break room when Blake Hunter typed out the words that would change the culture of Quick Choice. The memo, titled simply, I was wrong, had reached every store, every inbox, and every break room wall before the end of that week. Unlike the usual flood of corporate announcements, which typically came with charts and bullet points and a tone too polished to feel real, this one had been different. It wasn't reviewed by a PR team. It wasn't softened by legal. It wasn't filtered through branding. It had come directly from him. And people noticed. Some didn't believe it at first. Many, in fact. A lot of employees had grown too accustomed to being overlooked, too tired to believe in another promise from another executive who would vanish once the headlines faded. But the difference wasn't in the words. It was in what followed. At store hash 17, the laminated sign by Register 3 remained in place, now held by a sturdier frame. Employees stopped to read it daily, and new hires were shown it on their first day of orientation. It became, unofficially, the store's oath. If you're tired, you can sit. If you're struggling, you can speak. You will not be punished for being human. Jada Wallace stood beneath that sign most days, still working Register 3, but now by choice. Her hours had increased, but more importantly, so had her voice. She hadn't asked for recognition. She hadn't sought leadership, but it had found her anyway. After Blake's visit, a new initiative had been launched quietly across the company. Voices First. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't publicized outside the internal network, but for the first time in the company's 2-decade history, a rotating council of frontline workers was formed. Cashiers, stockers, custodians, clerks, employees who had always been the bottom line of someone else's spreadsheet, now reviewed every major HR policy before implementation. The council met weekly. Not in corporate boardrooms, but in break rooms, in cafeterias, in the back corners of stores where real conversations happened. Jada chaired the first team. Her role wasn't ceremonial. She read the proposals, asked hard questions, and challenged executives to explain how each decision would affect not just labor percentages, but the people behind them. She wasn't afraid to say no. She had already lived the cost of silence. Blake visited often. He no longer arrived with fanfare or entourage. He walked in quietly, usually with a coffee in hand, and sat at the edge of meetings, listening. He no longer corrected people when they called him Blake instead of Mr. Hunter. He preferred it. Across the company, change began to take root, not everywhere at once, and not always cleanly, but persistently. In the Birmingham district, a young man named Carlos implemented a peer buddy system to help onboard new hires. In Dallas, a store manager rewrote their entire weekly schedule process after a cashier reminded her that school schedules were non-negotiable. In Tallahassee, a woman named Trina placed a second brake chair behind each register, not for emergencies, but as a reminder that rest wasn't a privilege, but a necessity. Turnover dropped. Customer complaints lessened. But these weren't the metrics that mattered most. The change was felt in slower, subtler ways. There were more thank yous at the end of shifts. More managers asking, "How are you doing?" and actually waiting for the answer. There were fewer tears in storage rooms and more laughter in stock aisles. For the first time in years, employees began referring to the company as "we" instead of "they." Blake still traveled, but now his itinerary was written by the teams, not his assistants. He'd spend a day shadowing a cashier in Toledo, then mop floors in a store in Mississippi. He attended potlucks, rode along on deliveries, ate vending machine snacks with third-shift crews, and in every place he visited, he asked the same question: "What do you need?" Sometimes the answers were small: better gloves, working microwaves, a clock that wasn't 10 minutes off. Other times they were harder: respect, childcare help, safety from harassment. Whatever the response, he listened. He wrote it down, and when he didn't have the answer yet, he admitted it. In Atlanta, store hash 17 became something of a quiet symbol. Not a showroom or an idealized model, but a reminder. People from other stores visited. They saw the sign. They saw Jada. They asked questions. They went back to their own locations carrying stories, not slogans. One afternoon in mid-July, a woman entered the store with her daughter. The child, no older than 10, tugged on her mother's hand and pointed at the sign. "What's that mean?" she asked. Jada, overhearing from her register, smiled softly. She stepped around the counter and knelt slightly to the child's level. "It means this place sees you," she said, "even when the world doesn't." The girl nodded, satisfied, and wandered off to look at the candy display. After they left, Royce, still store manager but different now, approached Jada and leaned against the counter. "You've got away with people," he said. Jada gave him a look. "You saying I should be running this place?" He held up his hands, chuckling. "Just saying I'm glad you're here." She nodded. That was enough. Later that week, during the Voice's first meeting, Jada sat at the head of the table, a folding table in the break room surrounded by employees from various departments. Beside her sat a young woman who had recently lost her brother and was struggling with inconsistent hours. Across from her, a middle-aged man who had taken custody of his grandchildren and needed flexible scheduling. They talked not just about policies, but about stories. Real ones. They debated, disagreed, laughed, shared. In the corner of the room, Blake sat with his notepad. He didn't speak unless asked. When he was asked, he answered simply, and when the meeting ended, he helped clean up like anyone else. Before leaving, he stopped at Register 3. It was quiet, midday lull. He looked at the sign again. It was a bit faded now, fingerprints smudging the corners. "You ever think," he said to Jada, who was logging out of her shift, "about writing something better than that?" She looked at the sign, then back at him. "No," she said, "that one's just right." He nodded. Outside, the heat rolled off the pavement in waves, the air thick with southern summer. Blake stepped into the brightness, shielding his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of a company resting solely on his shoulders. He felt it moving, alive, distributed, growing, not just as a business, but as a body made of people who were no longer invisible. The world hadn't changed. It was still hard, still unfair. Rent was still late, Hours still short in places. But there was something else now. A space. A breath. A place where someone could sit and be tired and be seen. And that, perhaps, was the most human beginning of all. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video and explore other stories that matter. And please share this video. Someone out there might need it today.